What can we as students do to minimize the economic impact? Far most important is that we stay at home if possible, that we try to make sure that the virus isn't being spread any further. Only when we really are sure that the virus is not being spread any further or clearly being reduced, then this will allow us to actually reboot the economy again and have firms and people working again. To which economic impacts, recessions, can this upcoming one be compared? Well, actually, this is something which we haven't seen before. It's not comparable to any crisis, because this time the crisis is coming from the health aspects of the economy. We have a very different situation than we did have, for instance, in 2008 in the financial crisis situation. It's also very different from the Great Depression and from any war which we have witnessed. The situation here is that we are voluntarily staying at home, trying to reduce the impact of the virus on our health, and that is having strong impacts on the economic situation as well. Hence, it's not really comparable to anything which we've seen before. Should we expect scientific funds to be cut for non-COVID related research? Currently, there is quite a focus upon anything related to the corona crisis. We still need to learn a lot about the crisis itself, about the ways we can handle it, and also what the consequences for the economy are. This is indeed going to increase the resources and that type of research substantially. Whether there will be crowding out, meaning the other research elements will lose in importance, it's difficult to forecast, but indeed it is not unlikely that at least some shifting of funds will take place over the years to come. Will this outbreak have lasting effects on the economy, consumer behavior? It is to be expected that we will change our behavior for longer periods of time than just during the current crisis itself. People will change their social behavior. We will be more careful to not catch a normal flu even. We might not be willing to travel as much as we did before. Hence, there will be consequences also in the longer term. It changes our behavior like other events have done in the past as well. We shouldn't overestimate this either, though. There is also the principle that many people will return to something close to normal once the crisis is over. But at the end of the day, this is still something which we will have to see to what extent that's going to happen. Is this the recession Didier Sornette predicted? I'm not quite sure what Didier did predict. This is a unique situation which people did think about in the past, but we were never really confronted with this. It is, in that sense, really unique. It's one of these black swans, which we normally discuss in finance, and now it's hitting the health economy and the social economy, and thereby the real economy. Will globalization be largely influenced by the pandemic? We already before the outbreak of the corona crisis see that globalization was a topic which was not always positively seen by politicians and people in society. We've seen the last couple of years that there was no longer a strong increase in globalization as we've seen in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Hence things were already changing. This crisis is most likely going to make the globalization tendencies move in the same direction. We will see a further flattening out, maybe even a reduction in the medium to longer run. Firms will think about their production change. They will try to see that they not only import inputs from far destinations, they are also thinking more and more about, well, what happens in scenarios like we currently are facing, and how should our company deal with that? This kind of movement is most likely going to change the way in which many parts of the economy is going to function. Will Swiss companies have a lower budget to hire employees? What we're facing now is turning into a huge economic crisis. This is going to be a big strain on many, many companies. They have liquidity issues in the short run, and some of them will be facing also solvency issues in the medium to longer run if they're not able to continue the operations the way they did before the crisis. Then indeed this is going to lead to a decline in overall employment activities in Switzerland. It's not clear from today's perspective to what degree this will happen, but indeed overall there will probably be a less positive development of the labor market in Switzerland than otherwise would have been the case. What is better for the economy, complete versus partial shutdown? Well, to be honest, we cannot have a complete shutdown. It's simply not feasible. We need the health sector to be functioning, especially now. The health sector, however, also needs inputs from other sectors. If you go through the analysis carefully, then you will very soon discover that many things cannot simply be closed down without interrupting essential elements of the economy. Everything is interconnected with each other. So what we need to do is find a way in which the least essential parts are closing down to the extent possible, move down a couple of gears if we talk about a car, so to speak, but we also have to realize we cannot completely shut down everything at the same time. As soon as we start doing that, we will have huge problems keeping essential parts running, and we will have huge problems once the crisis is over to really get the economy going again. We can only allow us to move down a couple of gears and keep the motor running to some extent, allowing us to move forward again when the time comes. What are some of the most relevant papers dealing with this or similar scenarios? Well, actually, there is currently a large discussion going on amongst economists as of how to model what we're currently seeing. We're all having a very similar opinion that this is very unique. We cannot simply take old academic research and twist it in such a way that it's easily applicable to the current situation. So if you're interested in us how we at KOF Swiss Economic Institute are viewing the current situation, then please visit our website and go to our Corona page there. What is our forecast for the current small and medium-sized parts of the Swiss economy? Well, actually, we're no longer talking about forecast internally. We're talking about scenarios. It is still too unclear how the future will look like. So we have to think about different scenarios, think about different durations of the current measures that politicians have taken, and based upon that, try to get an impression as of how deep the recession will be and how quickly we can recover from that. Small, medium-sized enterprises will be hurt quite a bit. Therefore, it's so important that governments all around the world, including the Swiss government, takes this very seriously and make sure that especially these small, medium-sized enterprises are being kept alive through liquidity measures, through employment reduction measures, which allows them to still keep these people working for the same company, but not on their pay scale to the same extent as in normal times. How much will it affect educational institutions? Well, we've seen at the ETH that we've moved in no time from traditional education towards online lectures. Hence, we are making experiences which otherwise we would not have had. Most likely, this will remain, at least to some extent, viable also in the future. Although at the same time, I do believe that many of us would be pleased to meet students again physically and at the same time go to normal lecture rooms again and teach classes in the traditional way. How will the economic impact change the lives of people living in Switzerland? It's still very difficult to tell what the long-term consequences are. Most likely we will be affected also in the medium to long run. We will be more careful about cleaning our hands, about taking distance to people who might have a cold or have a flu. These kinds of elements will probably remain stronger for quite some time and in that sense have an effect. At the same time, it will also have an effect on those who are economically being hit by the current crisis, might lose their job and might have difficulties finding back a job in the future. These kinds of longer-term impacts are likely going to happen and we all have to deal with those. If the situation stays like this for more than 2 months, how long will it take for the economy to recover? It's very difficult to say. What we do know is that the longer the crisis will remain here and will stay, the more difficult it will become to get out of the crisis, and the longer it will take for us to get out of the crisis. We do expect that at the beginning there will be a relatively swift recovery, but at the same time we also realize that firms are financially in a very difficult situation nowadays, and that might lead to lower investment activities in the future, and therefore also to lower growth in the medium to long run. So there might even be permanent effects for the overall macroeconomy. When will we see the biggest dip in the economy? Well, we're currently still in the phase that firms are reducing gears, so to speak, or shifting down gears. We see that less and less is being produced already during the last couple of weeks. We expect that this process will continue. In particular, in the month of April, production will most likely be at its lowest level. We do hope that from May onwards, the economy might slowly move back into a somewhat more normal mode, but also this will take time. This will not happen overnight or within a very short period of time. This will most likely take months for the economy to recover to quite some extent. How will the aviation industry change? The aviation industry was hit as one of the first. We see currently that the number of flights all over the world has been sharply reduced. This is going to lead to certain firms in this particular sector to go bankrupt. They might have to merge with others to at least have the resources there to restart after the crisis is over. But there will also most likely be a medium-term impact on this particular sector. People will be more reluctant to travel far distances as they have been before the corona crisis. That kind of change in behavior is probably going to be there for quite a time. Is a complete lockdown more harmful than isolating the high-risk people? Well, first of all, we cannot have a complete lockdown. We need essential parts of the economy to keep on running. And for the essential parts of the economy nowadays, for instance, the health sector, we need other sectors to be running as well, at least to a certain extent. Hence, a complete lockdown is simply not feasible. The question whether it is sufficient to isolate high-risk people and have others go back to work in a normal sense is a good question. There are many discussions between economists going on about what the best way is to proceed. This is not necessarily obvious. We do know that one of the problems with the virus is that during the first phase in which someone is infected, there are no symptoms and that person can still infect others. If we isolate the high-risk person, the question is to what extent will this be a complete isolation? To what extent will it actually be feasible for them to also remain out of contact with those who might already be affected but do not show the symptoms yet? So also there the question is a complete isolation of risk groups feasible, yes or no? And many believe that also that's not feasible. How long can we sustain the current measures? It's not clear how long we can stay in the current production mode. The longer this lasts, the more difficult it will become to keep the system alive, so to speak, to make sure that the structures are still there when the recovery is needed and when the crisis is behind us. How long this is feasible for us to work at this low production mode is unclear to many of us. We have never seen this situation, but the risks are increasing the longer the duration lasts. Would it be worse for our economy if only Switzerland was affected instead of the entire world? Well, actually, it would be the other way around. If the rest of the world would not be suffering the current crisis, then we would still have demand for our products. We would still be able to get the inputs which we need for our production processes. So in that sense, it would be much easier if only one country, in this case Switzerland, would be in a shutdown mode. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we not only are suffering loss of demand from our own customers in Switzerland, we're also suffering from a loss of demand from abroad, and some firms have problems getting the right inputs for their production process from abroad and from other domestic sources. Are there projections of how many people won't make ends meet due to quarantine? What we do observe is that the number of people working at home now or being put on short-time work has increased substantially in Switzerland. Most of these people will still get the same type of salary as before, and hence should be able to make their ends meet, in the sense that they also probably have lesser cost than usual. Of course, there are other cases in which this does not prevail. Hopefully the safety nets which are being put in place by the government will support these people. What company will gain most from the pandemic? Well, what we observe is that certain firms who are in particular active in the health sector are benefiting. Also, firms who already are in the online world very active have a first mover advantage in this particular case. So there we do see that there has been a clear increase in demand. For the overall economy, however, it's very clear that total value added has been decreasing during the last couple of weeks. So most firms are actually suffering, but as usual, there are firms who do gain, and therefore also countries who are probably in relative terms in a better position relative to other countries than otherwise would have been the case. How severely will it affect funding of science not related to virology? Well, we do see that there is an increased demand for research related to the current virus situation. They will probably take up more funding than otherwise would have been the case. Whether this is going to be additional funding or whether there's going to be a crowding out effect, meaning that other types of research will lose parts of the funding to finance the new types of research, that's unclear. Most likely it will be a combination of the two. Why are companies with huge wage bills so insolvent? Well, if you look at what's happening currently, then firms are being requested to reduce the amount of production. Partly this is through government policy, partly due to problems they have with getting the right supplies, and partly because demand is simply lacking. So all of these three factors make firms produce less than normal. They nevertheless do have fixed costs which they have to bear. And one of the most important elements here are personnel costs. People are still engaged at these firms and do deserve their income. Hence, if a firm has a large fraction of employees on their total cost side, then this is actually creating liquidity problems for them very quickly, and therefore potentially also might drive them into insolvency and therefore bankruptcy. Hence, it's so important that the government here in Switzerland has put into place two pillars. And in the first pillar, they have indeed provide financial means for firms to reduce their personnel costs through so-called short-time labor. People are staying at home, still get from the state, from the social security system, their income to a certain extent, and firms are being helped in the sense that they no longer have the same wage bill as they otherwise would have had. How long will it take for the effects to be reversed, financial and economic impact? Well, we're currently still in the phase that production is depleting. We don't know how far we will actually have to go down in our production levels. It will probably take several months, if not quarters, for us to get back to an old previous production level. The duration will largely depend upon how strong the negative impact will be, and in particular, how long it will take before we are able to lift the current bans on the production side. Will research funding be increased or decreased in the next years? Well, on the one hand, we see an increased demand for new types of research, which so far was not on the forefront of our research agenda. That actually makes me believe that there will indeed be additional funding going into research. But on the other hand, we also do see that many states in the world will have spent large amounts of money to get through the current situation. This will raise public debt situations around the world, also in Switzerland, and that might actually have a negative impact on how much resources there will be for fundamental research. How has this affected the stock market? Well, what we've seen the last couple of weeks is clearly a sharp decline in many indices around the world. The financial market participants fear a very strong and deep recession and do not yet really see the end at the light of the tunnel, so to speak, the light at the end of the tunnel, and in that sense are very careful. The decrease which we've seen in the last couple of weeks is of an historical magnitude. We haven't seen these kinds of declines since ages. In comparison to the financial crisis in 2008, how much worse is this economic impact going to be? Well, what we observe is that the labor market is reacting much stronger than it did in 2008. The number of unemployed persons will probably rise much further than we've seen in the crisis of 2008-2009. On the other hand, it's not clear whether real value added will decline as much, because back then, many of the losses were taken by the financial market, which didn't really have such a strong impact upon employment itself. And now we see that the first order effects are rather on the employment side, that firms are reducing the employment activities quite substantially. Will there be a permanent effect on how we work, for example, continuing home office? We've all seen how quickly many of us move to online platforms and try to work from home. I think many of us will be very happy to move back into the office. So in that sense, the current situation will not continue as it is. But we have learned that in certain situations, indeed working from home or using online platforms to have meetings does work and can actually sometimes be even more efficient. So I do expect that we will not completely return to the old way of meeting, but that we will use more and more these online platforms also in the future. How will the average person who does not have so much knowledge about economics feel the economic impact of this pandemic? Well, what we have to realize is that we're losing billions of value added, that is income every week that we're not producing to the full extent. This means that on average, the Swiss society at large will earn less than it usually does. And of course, that will have consequences also on, for instance, wage developments. We will not see the same types of wage developments as we would have otherwise have seen. On top of that, people will become unemployed. Hopefully, they will find new jobs after the crisis is over, but the increased unemployment will, of course, hit these persons in particular. How will the coronavirus affect the local job market in the next year? What we're currently seeing is that firms are actually not hiring additional personnel, at least overall they're not hiring additional personnel. Some sectors might be slightly different, but overall there is a decline in employment, in employment going on currently. It will not be the highest priority of many firms to start new hiring processes. They will first of all try to get their own company up and running again. And only after they have been able to reach all production levels, normality can be assumed again, and meaning that from that moment onwards, firms will also start hiring additional personnel again. But this will take some time to come, and hence it will certainly have an effect on the job market in the upcoming time period. Are there positive effects of the pandemic in some industries? Indeed, not all industries lose currently. There are sectors who actually gain in importance. The health sector is the obvious candidate, but also other sectors which, for instance, are closely involved in online activities. There is an increased demand for these, and those who do offer these kind of activities do benefit from that. How much is the economic loss per fatality on average? It's not so much the question how much the fatality are costing us, it's actually the other way around. How many lives are we saving by the current measures? That's a very difficult number to guess. At the moment, it's unclear. There are thought experiments which might suggest that if we would let the pandemic go all across the world, then in total there would be something like a 40 million death toll, which would prevail. The question is, how much is that worth, and what can we do there? This is almost a philosophical question which are difficult to answer for us economists. What are the long-term effects of this pandemic? Well, what we have to realize is that it will change behavior to some extent. We will probably be less likely to travel to the same extent as we did before. We will be using more online platforms than we did before. On the other hand, nevertheless, many things will go back to usual. What we're currently facing is more or less a temporary reduction in activity, which ultimately does not have to prevail to the same extent. However, firms will face a different financial situation. They are currently facing large costs, which somehow have to be coped. That is probably going to increase their debt burden for the near future. And what we do know from the past is that if firms are highly indebted, and this is most likely going to lead to less investment activities of these firms, and therefore less innovation in the near future. Is it better to bail out companies or let them go bankrupt? Well, the answer is very clear. We cannot let too many firms go bankrupt. If that's going to be the case, then we are going to move into a systemic crisis. If many firms at the same time are insolvent, then that will create a cascade of additional insolvency through the supply chain and through the financial sector. If that's the case, then we're really in a financial crisis, and this is something which we do not hope for. So at the moment, the best strategy is to make sure that firms are able to get through the current situation. So enough liquidity should be made available to these firms so that they can actually start up again once the crisis is over. Is there any real chance that the socio-economic system will be profoundly changed to address the systemic issues? Well, what we're currently facing is a situation in which we actually do want the system to sustain the way it is. We simply want to move, at least in certain parts of the economy, into a kind of sleep mode. And we like to be able that after the pandemic has been put under control, that actually the sleep mode is over and these sectors, these firms can restart their business again. So currently, it's not the time to change the structure. Perhaps after the crisis, we can rethink about what went wrong, what didn't went wrong, and think about the future. But this is not the time to try to fundamentally change the way in which we work. Do you think this will start a global recession? We're in the middle of a global recession. It's not only Asia which is being hit. Currently, Europe is hit even harder, and the United States is also being hit very strongly. Given that we thereby cover large parts of the entire world economy, it's clear that we are now in a recession. And the question is rather, how deep will this recession be and how quickly can we get out of it again? But for that, we first need to deal with the health issues. Is there any chance that we might see a nationalized airplane industry? Well, what we now need is to bridge the current situation in which firms cannot produce as much as they did in the past. And indeed, the airline companies are one of the first who were hit by the crisis. They're probably not going to be the last. What the task of the government currently is to make sure that the current economic structures can survive so that we can reboot or restart after the pandemic crisis is over. Hence, it is well possible that certain states, certain governments will be forced into a situation in which they take partly ownerships of some of the larger companies just to prevent a collapse of the system. Is there a point at which lockdown costs outweigh the consequences of economic damage? Theoretically, there is indeed this point. It's, however, very, very difficult to judge at what situation it would be more worthwhile to let the pandemic roll and in what situation it's not so worthwhile. These are decisions which politicians need to make. We as economists already have problems trying to measure what the current economic costs are going to be like. Can the quarantine data be used to model an economy with reduced travel and CO2 emissions? We are now in a world which cannot last forever. In that sense, I do not believe that the current situation with respect to emissions is something which can be used as an indication as of where the future might lie. We are, with our economy, producing way below what is normal, and we can probably sustain this for a while, but we can certainly not sustain this for longer periods of time. Will the result be an extinction of all the pensions for retired people? It's at this stage, I do not believe that our social security system is going to be fundamentally changed because of this. Pension schemes will remain as they are. We have to think about, once we're out of this crisis, what the fiscal situation is like, to what extent the state has indebted itself that much that it has to cut down on certain type of social activities and schemes, but it's too early to really tell that right now. Will more goods be produced locally to better prepare for such times when the transport is hindered? Currently, transportation is not necessarily the biggest issue. The problem is the lockdown of labor and the way in which we're trying to get the pandemic into control. There will, of course, be changes in the way our supply chains will be organized. I do expect that firms will think about backup plans, so to speak, but these backup plans can go in both directions. Maybe a next crisis is rather local in nature, and then it's actually very good to also have outside options. Currently, indeed, there might be a tendency towards more local production, or at least production inputs and outputs which are produced nearby. In the worst case scenario, how long will there be a rising unemployment rate? We're currently in the phase that firms are reducing production. Also, in the period in which they can increase production, they will not immediately think about hiring additional personnel. So in that sense, the unemployment rate will even continue to rise in the recovery phase, and only after we've moved back to a more or less normal situation, we will see a stop in a rising unemployment rate and maybe even then decline. So we are facing a period of several quarters in which the unemployment rate will tend to rise.